James City County School Board to order. Ms. Aller, could you please take the roll?
Dr. Cavazos.
Present.
Ms. Chen.
Here.
Mr. Hodges.
Here.
Mr. Hosang.
Here.
Mrs. Hunley.
Here.
Mr. Riffle.
Here.
Mrs. Donner.
Here. May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Madam Chair, I move to approve the agenda as presented.
Thank you, Mrs. Hunley. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Hosang. Ms. Aller, please take the vote.
Mrs. Hunley.
Aye.
Mr. Riffle.
Aye.
Dr. Cavazos.
Aye.
Ms. Chen.
Aye.
Mr. Hodges.
Aye.
Mr. Hosang.
Aye.
Mrs. Donner.
Aye. Thank you. We are now in the budget work session. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Kiefer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the school board. We are pleased to be with you for budget work session number 2. Frankly, it's actually budget conversation number 3 because we also had some dialogue back in December. You are likely going to recall, or maybe you aren't, and I'm going to remind you that last time when we got together, there were 3 guiding questions that I put out for the board's consideration as we continue to think about our fiscal decisions. And the question in the first place that I asked was, how do our financial investments most directly support student learning and well-being? The second question I posed in advance of last week was, how do we remain competitive in attracting and retaining the people that our students depend upon every day? And then the third question was, how do we steward public resources in a way that is transparent, strategic, and sustainable? I pose those questions again this evening as we dive into a little bit more richer discussion, or pardon the pun, around compensation and our need to really explore a couple models relative to compensation. As we talk about that, I think it would be important for us to set the table with respect to how our compensation has increased in the last couple of years. So looking at slide 1.
Can I read my disclosure?
Oh,
I'm
yes,
sorry.
absolutely.
I wasn't sure. Okay. As a member of the school board of Williamsburg, James City County, I acknowledge that I may have an interest in the FY27 school budget because my husband is an employee of WJCC schools. However, I believe that I am able to participate in the consideration of and vote on the budget fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
Sorry, Ms. Hunley.
It's okay.
So let's talk a little bit about pay increases over time within Williamsburg, James City County. And we put this slide in there as an indicator of our work at the administrative level, at the board level, for salary increases since 21-22. All told, about 25% cumulative increase over those course of years. Those figures reflect our continued commitment to improving compensation, and that's in some cases, especially in 4.5 and 5.6, before we factored in equity adjustments and study-driven changes. We know, however, that there is still work to do because it was a recurring theme in the transition plan report, it was a recurring theme in the transition survey, and in just about every conversation I had with staff, that compensation continued to remain at the forefront. It's also important for us to look at instructional turnover and teacher vacancies. And joining me this evening for most of the presentation will be Emily Haywood. Emily works as a director in human resources. And Emily, I want to pitch it to you for the next series of slides, please.
Thank you. So teacher turnover has been a persistent challenge for us. After a dip during the pandemic, departures surged and have only recently stabilized. Understanding why our educators leave is critical as we shape strategies to retain talent. To dig a little deeper into the data from this past school year, we had 137 instructional staff resign or retire in the 24-25 school year. Within that 137, we had 20 retirees and 19 relocations, and 12 that left the profession. Nearly half of the teachers with less than 10 years of experience left within the first 10 years of his service. This trend underscores the importance of addressing early career support and compensation competitiveness to reduce attrition.
What we're going to do on the next series of slides is to showcase for you a couple different models, and those models are designed to help the board be aware of a compensation increase for staff at the 2% level, which is what's right now in the outgoing governor's budget, and then potentially layering on compensation study information. I'm going to have Emily walk us through that with respect to our regional rankings. We also want this to be a conversation for the board to ask questions as we go and to give staff, administration feedback in terms of where you would prefer that we continue to focus our efforts. So Emily, talk us through a little bit on this slide, and then we'll transition to the next slide as well.
This comparison shows how our bachelor scale stacks up regionally. While modest increases help, targeted adjustments through the compensation study are essential to improve our standing and attract qualified candidates. We currently have 382 teachers with bachelor's degrees, so that's what's represented with the scale, and this shows you what would happen if we went with just a 2% increase, and then if we layered the compensation study on top of that 2% increase, potentially if our competition was also doing a 2% increase.
Let's look at the next opportunity.
This table illustrates where we are compared to our neighboring school divisions and the impact of a 2% raise on our current scale. This ranking shows where we would be if we did 2% and neighboring school divisions also did 2%, and the third column shows our ranking if we implement additional funds to continue making progress on phase 2 of the compensation study. Strategic increases could position us as a leader in the region, particularly for mid-career educators. For reference, we currently have 520 with master's degrees and then 130 teachers with master's plus or doctorates.
So if you're doing the math in your head, it's about a third and then 2/3. So 2/3 of our instructional staff have the advanced degrees, and a third are in the bachelor's category. I think the next slide really captures the essence of what the 2% plus compensation study would look like.
Year 2 of the compensation study implementation focuses on correcting market gaps and improving step progression. These changes aim to reward experience and credentials more effectively, ensuring fairness and competitiveness across all lanes.
So let's pause there for just a second and see if you have questions that emerge or thoughts about layering the compensation study funding on top of a 2% raise.
Thanks, Dr. Keever. Do board members have any questions, thoughts?
Well, I really liked seeing the rankings, if others are doing the same, that we were first place on several seconds. So to me, that was impressive, knowing that the other school divisions may do the same thing. So
One of our challenges being a little bit earlier in the operating budget discussion process is where the numbers per division are not necessarily formally shared. I think the other scenario that we find as I talk regionally with other superintendents is that oftentimes folks are not willing to say, this is the hand that I have in front of me. That most of us will say 2% is where we are, and that if we are able to do additional, we'll try to work that through. So I do not have a strong handle right now on how the local competitors will be looking in terms of the salary increases. I think we all are hopeful that it is potentially more than 2% at the state level, which would allow us some different modeling scenarios at the local level if we chose to do that. The other piece that I just want to reference is that if you'll note across the 4 different categories that there are some potential sizable increases for members of the staff related to years of service and where they fall within certain lanes. And as we look at the data in terms of our teacher workforce, Emily mentioned that nearly 50% of our folks that left last year left before year 10. So one of our markers that we want to hold out there is year 10. So we really look at years 10 through 22, 23 in terms of trying to position ourselves well, because if we can keep you in the fold and build a culture around you for the first 5, your ability to get to 10 is stronger. And once you're with us for 10, we feel like we've done enough to keep you through, but we want to continue to see that percentage increase. You'll also remember through the compensation study last year that we did some discussion about ensuring that there was appropriate progression between our steps, and this move allows us to create that 1.25% between each of the steps on the instructional teacher scale.
When we say from 1 to 10, I know a lot of teachers, if they started out and they maybe didn't get tenure, could that be some of the reason why we've lost so many between 0 and 10? Is just or on an improvement plan because they were new to the whole teaching thing and it just didn't work out?
Well, that's a little bit of a challenging question to answer. I think that sometimes folks in the first year or two make a determination that teaching is not their passion and something that they wish to continue to pursue, and sometimes that's good for them and it's good for us. At the same time, I think that the data nationally would suggest that years 0 through 5 are those critical years of supporting new teachers into the profession. And if you can sustain your energy and sustain your passion for those first 4 or 5 years, your likelihood of maintaining continuity in that profession is enhanced. So one of the pieces that we really started to look at is, gosh, 50% of our folks are leaving within the first 10 years. We feel like we're building a stronger culture. Is there a compensation piece that we want to continue to work on as well? So it's dual-edged there. Any other questions on how we might address year 2 of the compensation study to combine with the 2% proposed raise from the governor?
Oh, not seeing any.
One of the comments that we've heard quite about is kind of understanding where our employees are relative to the grade placements. Remember, we went from a support scale and an administrative scale to a unified scale, compressing or combining the two into one. You're going to hear us talk a little bit tonight on the unified scale around what those particular placements are within quartiles in the range. So the range starting at 1550 for this particular grade going all the way to 2328, and it kind of gives you a sense of where employees fit within that. You'll also hear us model a 3% salary increase for the unified scale. So Emily, talk us through a little bit of this and we can show what that looks like.
So on this slide, we see the distribution of custodians, cafeteria workers, and bus aides across the pay range. And it helps us understand where employees fall to identify compression and plan equitable adjustments. And for reference, a question from last week, or I believe was 7 employees are at the minimum of the 1550, which is the minimum of our pay, and where our unified scale starts.
So of the 1,900 or so employees, 7 are making $15.50 an hour.
Correct.
Okay. So does this help you understand graphically where folks are within the range of the scale from the entry point to the midpoint to the max? So if we modeled this out on a 3% salary increase for this particular grade, Emily, talk us through that.
So this is modeling the grade U01 and where we would fall if we did a 3% increase and our neighbors did a 3% increase. So you can see we would land 3rd in our ranking with our region.
So in this case, we didn't use the 2% for our competitors. We went ahead and bumped up to 3 because we thought it would be important to look at that as well. You're never sure exactly where people are going to fall. We do think on the unified scale there's the need for a 3% compensation adjustment, so we wanted to show you what that would look like. And keep in mind that there are only 7 employees that are at that minimum level. So more often than not, folks are coming in with some level of experience and are placed further into the scale.
Right.
Okay. Go ahead, Emily.
This breakdown illustrates where level 1 teacher assistants fall within pay grade U02. These teacher assistants may work in general education, special education, and preschool.
So let's pause there for a second. That on this particular grade, you see that we have, I don't want to say only 19 employees, but only 19 employees on this particular grade. And again, it's above the 1550, so it's 16 in that lower first quartile, and then spread through. You'll see more teacher assistants, et cetera, in the grade 2. Excuse me, grade 3.
Grade 3. On this slide, we show the distribution of employees in pay grade U03, which represents teacher assistants that are level 2, as well as receptionists, media assistants, data entry, and specialty drivers. So this is where the majority of our teacher assistant workforce falls.
So let's look at what a 3% raise for teacher assistants would model at, recognizing that in some cases, board members, we are not able to directly compare apples to apples as we look at our competitors. Emily can talk a little bit more about that as she explains out.
Sure. So this comparison shows our position relative to neighboring divisions and the effect of a 3% raise. We currently have 2 tiers of teacher assistants, and neighboring divisions may have structures that are unique to their operations. So for this purpose, this shows the impact of 3% on staff at the minimum for each entity. So there's some that have more than 2 levels. There's some that only have 1 level. So it's just comparing their minimum teacher assistant. Excuse me.
Any questions here?
I don't have any questions, but I have a comment. So when you all had the parapaloozle and I sat with teacher assistants, the ones that I heard from most were the ones that were like in special ed that do not have a nursing degree, but some of the things they were having to do with students, you would think they had to have, toileting, feeding, all kinds of things like that. And they said that it's an incredible heavy lift for them, for the pay. Mm-hmm. And then with the insurance eating up the pay.
Sure.
So I think I heard more from teacher assistants that were working, well, I think with special ed, and even, because when you think about it, you said for the children, if you have a one-on-one and it just gets to be too much, that child could get attached to a one-on-one that just can't continue that, and then you have to train another one-on-one. That's very disruptive. So
Sure.
If there were a way to, I don't know, I know one time we compensated some Bright Beginning assistants. We gave them like a little bonus or something. I can't remember one year. And they really appreciated that. It kind of said, we value what you have to do, because it's not just an assistant. There's a lot they're doing that pay. They could work in Walmart and make more.
Yes, ma'am.
So
I'm going to ask Dr. Brown if he would to talk a little bit about a stipend that we currently provide teacher assistants for intensive services. Adam, would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is last year would have been the 3rd year in which we have an intensive needs stipends, and last year 72 paraprofessionals received that stipend at the end of the year for similar support that they provide to our children.
So while it's not driven in terms of their hourly wage, it is something that we do afford folks that we know are going above and beyond, working directly with students that have specific and recurring needs that we are able to provide at the end of the school year. We'll also show you or talk a little bit about a potential option for us to consider a little bit later when we're talking about some stipends. Keep going, Emily.
Okay. On this slide, we show the distribution of employees in the bus driver pay grade. So this is where you're going to see your bus drivers, because they do have a unique pay grade to them. Transportation is a critical function. Bus drivers are obviously in very high demand, and this slide shows us how we compare regionally and the effect of a 3% increase on our ranking. WJCC currently ranks 3 out of 6 with our closest competitors.
I think based on the work of this board over the last year or two, you've seen us move up the rankings. We were further to the left as you look at this chart. Last year we made a very specific adjustment, and actually the last 2 years we've attempted to make specific adjustments. We are continuing to be able to hire bus drivers, whereas before we were struggling to even get people to apply for the role. So we have found that the increased compensation on the bus driver front has helped us solidify the workforce. You'll also remember that last year, as a part of our cost savings efforts to be able to get some other things accomplished, we pulled bus driver FTEs out of the budget. later in the presentation, you're going to see us making a case to put those back into the budget.
How does WADA's salary compare to ours?
We are, I haven't looked at that recently, but we're close in line with WADA.
Okay.
But they are generally 8-hour a day, 12-month contracts. So that is where they do have an advantage over school bus drivers.
Okay.
Upcoming slides outline targeted changes for support roles, career progression pathways, and equity adjustments. Each recommendation addresses gaps identified in the study, the compensation study, and supports retention and growth. This slide shows the recommendation that we create a career progression in our custodial positions by creating 2 custodial levels. We anticipate this would impact 86 employees with an estimated cost of $52,000. So currently, we just have 1 level custodian at grade U01.
And how do we look at progressing from grade 1 to grade 2? What would be some of the pieces that allow that to occur?
I think we're looking at performance and experience in the job.
So as I demonstrate a stronger ability, I'm able to move from one level to the next. Right. Whereas right now, there's no movement for me unless I want to go into a leadership or supervisory position.
Correct.
And the general custodian role is one that is critically important as we talk about cleanliness in buildings. It's also a role that if you ask about our vacancies week over week or month over month, that we generally have a fairly high vacancy rate of custodial positions. Part of that might be related to the fact that they're part-time. Part of that might be related to morning or evening, but it's also, I think, in some ways related to a lack of upward movement that is available. Tim, I'm putting you on the spot. I tried to give you a precursor by saying if you looked at our vacancy information. You ready? How many custodial vacancies do we have?
We currently have 10.
10, okay. So that's a fairly, as you look at our vacancies across the organization, 10 is double digits, and 10 is also, there are some buildings not getting the same attention during the day or in the evening as they need to be getting, or we are utilizing some substitutes to help us fill in.
And we don't have enough money for the contract to contract out custodians.
That is an entirely different scenario,
Okay.
contracted services for custodians.
Okay.
Something that we could explore not tonight, but
Okay.
something that we would need to really talk about in earnest.
Could you explain, explain the step one more time for, like, between custodian 1 and custodian 2?
Sure. Emily, talk a little bit about it.
So the idea would be experience and then skill-based. As somebody comes in perhaps as a new employee and has not been a custodian previously, grade 1, but then they would have a path after a year or more of service to move to grade 2 if they demonstrate capacity in their job and they learn the skills that they need.
Just 2 steps for custodians at this
That's
point.
what we're
Okay.
looking at right now, because there is a head custodian. There's a little bit more structure in the upper levels as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And we have 10 vacancies. How many custodians do we have?
We'll look it up for you. We might have it for you this evening. We don't want to tell you off the top of our head. We'll look it up.
Mr. Hodges.
And you had mentioned that there were some key vacancies at some buildings not getting the care that they might need. Do we know specifically which buildings those are, and if there's like 1 or 2 buildings that are particularly underserviced?
We can get you the vacancy listing. I will also tell you that our vacancies across buildings are kind of on a recurring basis. So I can tell you that there is a vacancy in this building tonight, and that vacancy may be filled tomorrow, but tomorrow the vacancy is over here. We do find with Unified Grade 1 that we have significantly stronger turnover rate, just being genuine. So at cafeteria staff, bus aides, custodians are the 3 job classes in Unified Grade 1, and that's where we have our highest number of vacancies on a recurring basis. So we'll check the FTE count under custodial, but there also are some nuances within that with respect to hours related to the contract, those kinds of things. So we'll can get some of that information for you, Mr. Hosing.
We're recommending reclassifications to the office staff and transportation from grade U05 to U06. These staff members all hold CDLs and have taken on additional levels of responsibility in the transportation office within their roles. This would impact 5 staff members, and the cost to address equity is estimated at $11,500.
Yes, Mr. Ruffin.
So this is an automatic bump in their scale, is what you're saying? Then on top of a raise, or just?
So it would be a reclassification, and so the groups of people, as we talk through this, everybody would move in the reclassification, and then the equity study piece of it would be on the side. So you could have 5 people that move grades, but only 3 are eligible for a pay adjustment because 2 might already be where they would fall in the new grade. So it's individual specific.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
No, sure. I mean, I think we talked about the process and how would the employee be notified. This is maybe something to go into a bit more because going through a scale, it sounds like they're going to get an increase, but then if they're not, they maybe what I mean. I think we talked about this last time. We talked about the adjustment.
Yes,
of the scale.
there would be a notification with each.
Thank you.
And this dialogue is not, it's irrespective of a 3%. Like if we went a 3% raise for unified scale, that's the base point for everybody. And some of these additional pieces we're talking about are layered on top compensation, not dissimilar to how we're talking about adding compensation in for the instructional side for the compensation study. These are the unified side. So remember, we have talked about a certain dollar amount for teachers and a certain dollar amount for support and unified staff. This is one of those areas that we're talking about there, just to make sure that we're speaking the same language.
So typically, let's say if the equity study showed somebody should get an extra 25 cents an hour, for example, on their hourly rate, they would get that, and then we would layer whatever the pay increase is on top of that, so they would get the full benefit of the movement through the lane.
Okay.
We've got information for you in real time. Ben, pretend like this is a late breaking news. Mr. Baker has the information. Mr. Baker.
We have 110 custodians now. Correct.
Thank you. Go ahead, Emily.
As part of the compensation plan implementation, we're also recommending creating a career progression for the mechanics and transportation to classify them to the appropriate grade and add an additional level. The estimated cost to implement this is $23,000 and impacts 6 staff members. So currently, we don't have the same leveling that we see at the county or even in other neighboring school divisions in terms of being able to place mechanics dependent on experience and skill that they bring to the table. So this is to try to start to address that and adjust the grades to make us more in line with our region.
I feel like we talked about this as a board last spring at various points. Bus drivers are really important, but when buses cannot get repaired and back on the road, that's also similarly as important, and maintaining a strong mechanic team is critical for our operations.
Additionally, we're recommending the creation of a career progression and levels to more appropriately classify our trades employees. The cost to implement this plan is $19,000 and impacts 19 employees. So this is the same kind of idea, taking our trades, and that would be carpenters, electricians, that type of thing, and going level 1, level 2, level 3, and then the foreman, and adjusting the grades to make them more aligned with what our competition looks like.
So here's
Yes,
where,
Mrs. Hundley.
oh,
Just
sorry.
remind everyone to get acknowledged by the chair. Yes, go ahead.
So this is where, so when we go to those signings for New Horizons, and those kids get signed, electricians and some of the other positions.
Trades
they
positions.
Get trades, they get signed to the shipyard because they're not going to really come to Williamsburg, right? Because we're not going to pay them what. So I'm just assuming there's no way we could get those kids, our own kids, into those because of the pay.
I'm not sure I'd say there's no way. I think that part of it has to do with what are you passionate about and most interested in. And some of those young people are really interested in working in the shipyards and the idea. And if we have talked some internally about how do we work to grow our own and create some of those learning experiences. I know that Mr. Snipes and team are continuing to look at that. Part of our ask in terms of this budget are 2 operations assistant positions where we can help grow a novice person into some more specific trades level. So we want to build and grow our own, just like we do with teachers. Part of it's pay, but part of it's also the culture of the organization, and I know we're working hard on that.
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr.
I had missed, how many people did you say this would affect?
19.
19, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Full.
You mentioned it would get into, I know we talked about mechanics, and Ms. Henley made me ask the question similarly. So pay based off, like, she did mention the shipyard and stuff like that, who have similar style of grading their employees, or in the scale we're trying to adjust. How far is this scale from, like, scales like for competing with, for like, like Bear or the people who build the missiles in James City County, kind of that kind of thing. There's a lot of other kind of manufacturing type jobs, especially as we go to the career days things. How does our scale at this like new progression compare, I guess is what I'm asking.
So we've primarily compared our progression and the trades and the mechanics on our neighboring school divisions and James City County that has some of these similar type positions, because that's typically the pool that we're drawing from. So that's where we've looked to make adjustments to get more equitable with those areas.
And I guess that makes sense because when you think about it versus the perspective, but I'm asking because Hampton also and Newport News similarly are competing the same pools, right?
Right.
So if we're kind of raising the tide, it kind of maybe hopefully mounts to something. Thank you.
We worked with high school principals and counseling chairs this year to refine and update the data entry position description. As a result of that work, we're recommending a realignment of this position to grade U05 and a title change to administrative assistant, which more properly aligns it with other administrative assistant positions within the division. This position is responsible primarily for entering student data in support of the counseling office, and we currently have 3 employees, 1 at each high school. We are also recommending the classification of our building-based substitutes to a teacher assistant 3 at an estimated cost of $21,000, which could impact 23 staff members. And then in addition, we're considering pay supplements for key special education staff at an estimated cost of $601,000.
And let's explore that for just a couple minutes. Dr. Brown potentially weighing in on that as we talk about trying to remain competitive in some areas and fields where we see turnover, we see vacancy, but we see the need for also consistent support from staff.
Correct, and I think we're looking at, when we say key special education staff, it's to Ms. Hunley's earlier point of those individuals potentially working in self-contained classrooms with students who demonstrate a higher level of need throughout the instructional day. And then additionally looking at instructional assistants providing support to those students with those high intensive needs. So whether it's in a self-contained setting or they're supporting those students receiving instruction in a general education classroom, those in our initial discussions are who we're potentially looking at with this. And those historically are some of the most challenging to staff due to the high level of need. And to your earlier point, those in those one-to-one positions, if they were to move to another position, it's a lot of additional training, support, building relationships with those students who benefit from that service.
We've also tried to look at some of our regional competitors in terms of how they position additional support for staff above the general compensation piece. And as we look across the way and a little bit further south, we know that New York and Newport News and Hampton have some additional financial support for those roles. And so we are strongly considering that within the operating budget this year. And I feel like we've heard that from the board over the course of the last several weeks and months in terms of providing additional support to staff.
Yes, Mr. Riffle.
Could we explain maybe a bit more about how a key special education staffer is explained to like an employee or ourselves when we think about this? Like, it sounds like we're maybe going to blanket it, but maybe more detail would be important here.
So we're talking about instructional staff or instructional assistants in buildings, so it's all building-based staff, and I think right now primarily self-contained is what we're looking at.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of make sure we're not clearing the mud a bit. Thank you. It is clear.
We are also mindful that at some juncture we're going to reach a threshold of inability to go and do more, and so we're leaving it a little bit broad right now as we really look at what are the numbers and what might those numbers turn out to be in terms of a per person supplement that we could provide. So we're still early, but we want folks to know that we are strongly considering it, and want board perspective on whether or not we should continue that, frankly.
Yes, Mr. Riffle.
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty for it. I'm also interested in seeing, whereas the state maybe doesn't play a part in our division, like what is considered the factor that limits us from receiving that type of pay compared to like Hampton and York or Newport News. That's just a factor we should consider as we move into the next session, and kind of bring up to appropriators at this time. So,
Could you help me understand what you're talking about in terms of?
sure. Is it our LCI that's limiting us, or is it like particularly because like we're limited in some forms of grants as well, right? Our division has the ability to have its constructed LCI tells us, like we can afford these things, which may not actually be true in its nature. And so I'm just trying to understand, like, if we're losing out on money compared to our neighbors, it's like, should we be advocating right now for? Does that make sense? I know it's a bit of a long-winded question, but there is a big tide ahead of us. So,
Right, and so maybe one of the things that would be worthwhile for the board to go back and look at would be the LCI comparative chart that Renee shared during our last budget work session, which really showed that Williamsburg and James City County were at the far right end of the local composite index. And when you're at the far right end of the local composite index, it means that you are going to receive fewer state dollars based on the calculation. And if you look at maybe York or maybe Newport News or maybe Hampton, they're to the left-hand side of that, which would mean that they get additional state dollars based on the index that's created.
So it's the index is what that's what I'm asking about.
Well, the index does have an impact on the dollars that come to us from Richmond.
Sure.
The other component of that is the word local, and so then the determination at the local level in terms of funding becomes the next layered component on top of that.
Thank you. I think you just kind of re-illustrated my point a bit more, like the superintendent. So thank you.
Yes, Mr. Hodges.
So as we've been going through the support adjustments, it's been like 11,000 here, 23,000 there, and then we get to this slide, and the estimated cost for these pay supplements jumps up to $601,000, and so that kind of obviously pops a little bit, and so I'm kind of curious, like, from that number, what does that mean, like, for an average employee who would be receiving this? Like, do we have any sort of idea, like, how tangibly that would improve their pay? Like, do we know that quite yet?
The dilemma with sharing that number publicly is that sometimes that's the only number that people hear and they don't realize that it's under consideration. So I'm not sure if we are able to kind of give a total number of people that we're talking about, both on the instruction and support side for this. Go ahead, Dr. Brown.
Looking at some of the personnel that we talked about in those key positions, we're potentially at this time looking at around 189 potential staff members impacted. But again, that's based off of initial discussions. That could change.
And that's part of the reason that number starts to go higher and higher is the number of people that you're talking about potentially being in consideration for this additional supplement.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I mean, that's a lot of employees, so I think that's important to kind of wrap our heads around.
Anything else on this one, Madam Chair?
Anything else? Okay. Nope. Thank you.
We are also recommending equity funds for school psychologists to ensure they are in line with their years of experience. And we are estimating the cost to provide adjustments for these staff members to be $35,500 and would impact 5 of our current staff. So we've had opportunities in years past to do some equity adjustments with some of these student support positions. We've done OTs and PTs and SLPs, and we've not had an opportunity to address school psychologists at this point.
This next one that Emily's going to talk about is one that we did share with you back in December, is on the consideration list. We want to just revisit it for you now.
To meet growing student needs, we're proposing to increase related services positions such as SLPs, OTs, and PTs, school psychologists, and social workers from 7 hours per day to 8 hours. This affects 48 full-time employees with an estimated cost of $640,000. These positions are essential for meeting mandated services and supporting student well-being.
So before we transition to the next part of the presentation, we've gone through a number of different positions that we think need additional adjustment beyond the 3% on the unified, or the 2% in the comp study on the instructional teacher scale. Are there other global questions or pieces of feedback that you can give to us as we continue to work through this?
Yes, Mr. Riffle, and then Ms. Hunley.
I love reviewing our meetings. It would be great to see this presentation with the FTEs in our executive content if possible, just kind of knowledge of then when we think about these scales and the number of people it impacts, just for our sake. Thank you. I know we mentioned it verbally, but it'd just be great to frame it when I'm not in this lovely room. So,
Mrs. Hunley?
So some of those positions, aren't they contracted?
They are.
That's what I thought. And then how does that work when some of them work with students that aren't quite in school yet, like 3-year-olds come in for, do the parents or someone pay for that, or to help us, or not?
In terms of, I'm not sure I can answer that question. Adam, Dr. Brown, do you have?
I think if students starting at 2 years old or 3 years old have come in and we've identified as a division that they require services from a speech language, if we've identified that, then we have SLPs, OTs, PTs working with that age population.
And we pay even though they're not currently with us yet.
So if they're in the Bright Beginnings program and they've identified through potentially like the child find process that they require specially designed instruction, they qualify under IDEA, we provide those services to those children if they're attending the Bright Beginnings program.
We might have a dollar amount on what we spend contractually for some of these positions. We might not.
The estimated cost for the current year is $840,000.
Right. So contracting out just south of $1 million. Now, will we need to continue to probably use contracted services for some of these roles? Absolutely. But we do find it difficult to maintain the staff that we do have because they can go elsewhere with an 8-hour contract. This I think will help us provide stronger service across the board, recognizing we may be able to pare back a little bit of the contracted services, and those folks then are our folks.
Yes.
Just one question. This obviously isn't every support person in the division. So there must have been, I would assume, some criteria to decide which of these classes would be supplemented and augmented.
This, in terms of related services, these would be those positions that are on the 7-hour contract. So we have different contract types. We are recommending that these in particular go to the 8-hour contract because right now they're on 7. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly.
Well, what I'm thinking is, I mean, we've seen a whole variety of different sorts of positions that are being supplemented or changed in their, their entry level. So there must have been some criteria that the staff used to decide that these were the particular people that we were going to talk about tonight. I don't think it includes everybody, correct?
Right, it does not include everybody. I think we've looked at results from the compensation study. We've looked at recurring vacancies. We've looked at where are we competitive with other school divisions that or public sector, private sector that we're hiring against, and that's why we're bringing these in particular this evening.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So we will move towards a little bit of a conversation around stipends, and want to kind of give you some back history. In 2013, the school division administratively went through an internal review process looking at what the stipends were that we paid, how were they classified, and the total numbers of students involved or total numbers of hours involved, and some of those kinds of scenarios. And there was an adjustment in 2013 to stipend totals. Those numbers of stipend dollar amounts remained static until 2023. So it's a 10-year period of time where we did not adjust any of the stipends. And in 2023, we brought forward a plan to make a 2.5% adjustment to all stipends in year one, and we were going to come back in year two and do another 2.5%. We only did that in 2023. And as we continue to hear from staff that we know are working with our students or serving in curriculum leadership positions or coaching our athletes, we know that we don't pay tons and tons of money, and frankly, they don't do it for tons and tons of money, but we do need to adjust our stipends. We also need to know where our stipends are in comparison to our neighbors, and so we engaged with Bolton, who did the compensation study. We engaged with them this fall to look at 10 school divisions near us and around us to get a determination of where our stipends are in relation to competitors. And the results of that study suggest that we have, let me back up. In some cases, similar to what we were talking about earlier, it is difficult to compare stipends as apples to apples. Some school divisions have multiple assistant coaches in particular sports. Some school divisions have multiple coaches at the junior varsity level. Some school divisions call them department chairs. Some school divisions call them curriculum leads. So they're perhaps synonymous activities, but difficult sometimes to compare across. As we've looked at the Bolton information, we do know that there are some places that we are below our competitors in market. So high school credit recovery facilitators, our high school debate sponsors, middle school drama, high school head cheerleading, just as some examples of areas where we are not measuring up regionally. 421 members of our staff receive an academic stipend, and 210 members of our staff receive an athletic stipend. We are also asking our stipend holders to give us some feedback in terms of the number of students that they support, the number of hours that they invest in a day or a week, or the number of staff members they work with if they're curriculum leads, because we see this as a 2-year journey to work to address stipends. Year one of that journey is to look across all of them and make some initial strong adjustments in year one. And year two is to create a tiered system around the level of stipend, because right now there is not a tiering associated with our stipends. And using the data that we receive back from stipend holders, we would be in a position in fiscal 28 to make some other potential adjustments. I'm not able to tell you right now whether the high school curriculum lead is going to get $5 more or $35 more, but what I am going to tell you is that we will be looking to make adjustments across the board, and specifically looking at those stipends that are below market. And the final thing I'll mention is that we have some things that as an organization we particularly value, and those stipends need to be adjusted commensurate with those things that we value.
So we're looking at the adjustment of 380K. Just is this like that's at the bottom bullet point kind of explains a bit like when you mentioned across the board, we're looking at that as like the next option for us.
So what we would do, and I'm not, I guess frankly, I wouldn't be asking the board to vote up or down a stipend for this coach or that coach. I would ask the board to review, to grant administration this within the budget, and then we'll come back to you with the pay book in May that will have the exact amount spelled out as we do on a yearly basis. But we need to make some very specific adjustments to our stipend totals.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
So
Ms. Hunley.
here's where I'm going to try to say this without getting in trouble. So, so what I've heard, so let's say I went to one sport where the coach did some, I'm not going to say minimal, didn't seem to have as much responsibilities as another sport, but the pay stipends were the same. So I didn't think that it was so much that part as there are people in stipends that say, I do all of this, da, 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 and I get this amount. And this person does this, has this little bit, and they get the same amount. And I work along. So are we going to address looking at that? Because that seems to be what the main issue is.
I think it's twofold, Ms. Hunley. I really do. I think that we could begin to parse out what different people believe their time and effort is worth within an activity or within some sort of sponsorship. I think it's appropriate for us administratively to work to tier those stipends based on more than a Bolton study, more of an internal conversation around what do we value, how many students are impacted, the level of time it takes in order to perform that. But that takes some qualitative information as well as quantitative information. I think out of the gate, we believe that there need to be upward positive adjustments to a number of the stipends in our stipend pay book now. And then the next layer of that is to work on a tiering system that says the tier 1 stipends are this, and here is the criteria as to why it is a tier 1 stipend.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Hodges.
Do you have any sort of rough idea what would qualify or what would make something like a tier 1 stipend versus like a tier 2, tier 3? Do you have something in mind for that yet, or is that more like broad framework?
It's a broad framework, but if you look at some other school divisions that tier their stipends, you might anticipate that certain varsity level sports that have high impact or high revenue gates or large number of students involved might find themselves in a tier 1, and those that have fewer students participating with a shorter season length might find themselves in a different tier. So that's a broad brush, and I think we have to be careful until we get some of that data back and kind of look across activity and look across event. But if you look at some other school divisions that have tiered them, that's generally how it pans out. Additionally, tier 1 for us as an organization, because we value it, might be those curriculum leads, because they're spending time every other day or day in and day out working with people within their department in terms of planning and collaborating. So that to me becomes, as an organization, we value that and we want to put that in the tier 1 category. So it's difficult to say across the different categories because we have the academic stipends, we have the activity stipends, and then we have the athletic stipends. So trying to apply some level of tiering structure across takes us gathering the data back and then doing some internal review.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions on that we can answer? There are a couple of contractual day changes that we are attempting to bring forward. The first one is for elementary and middle school reading and math specialists. You might remember that last year we brought forward a request for these groups of employees to move from 203 days to 205 days. We saw that as a 2-year journey to get this group to a 213-day contract. So we want to bring that back forward this year to hopefully finalize that. This allows for us to remain competitive as you think about people that have the certifications and specificity within their background to serve as reading and math specialists. It allows us to retain them, and in some cases it allows it to be a promotion to come join us from other school divisions because more contractual days are being offered. And then the last contractual day change we want to talk about is moving high school athletic directors from 233 days to 260 days. Outside of bringing on any additional athletic responsibilities for the athletic directors, there is a specific increase in workload for athletic directors with new legislation from the Virginia High School League in terms of eligibility that I believe necessitates athletic directors being 12-month employees. More often than not, they're spending time working for us in June and July. We might as well go ahead and formalize that by way of adding to their contract. So I believe that they need to move from 233 to 260.
Any questions? Thank you.
And then finally, let's talk about a few new positions that we would recommend, including for being under consideration in the budgeting process. Let me start by talking about the GTRT teacher. Last year there was a request for 2 of those teachers. That request did not make it through the budgeting process. We've talked long and hard this year about whether or not we feel like we can include it. At this point, we feel like we may be able to include 1. That might be a split model between 2 schools to continue to increase gifted and talented resources at 2 of our elementary schools, with the potentiality in a year or 2 to be able to revisit it and bring another one on. But as we talk about increasing the students identified for gifted services, we likely need to continue to look at increasing the staff associated with that. Elementary teacher assistant for behavior support. You'll see the number 4 next to that. You might remember that in the previous year we asked for 9. There is some conversation about asking for 4 in this budget process and looking to potentially reconfigure some staff who may be available for us to reassign into various positions, whereby perhaps each elementary school would find an additional resource. Without getting too specific on what that looks like, I think that we are comfortable requesting 4 in this particular operating budget to provide some behavioral support at the elementary level. You might also remember that I shared with you that we, in redoing some of the grant information, are bringing on 3 early education behavior support positions, which would work in conjunction with these folks and building leaders to provide additional elementary behavior support. I'll mention the 2 school security that are on the board. We do believe that we'll have a need in school year 27-28 for 2 additional SSOs at our Bright Beginnings campuses. We felt like we should consider bringing that into the operating budget this year and utilizing those positions, whether that be at the 2 elementary schools under construction or in some other places for a year. It lessens the FTE request that we would need to make in fiscal 28. So those 2 would be brought into the op budget. We're going to be moving into year 2 of our math curriculum, and we have 1 person right now working at the elementary school with our math team, and so bringing on an elementary math coach to support the work across our elementary schools we believe is particularly essential. In addition, I think it's important for us to consider an additional social worker to add to our staffing model. Frankly, we have a strong social work team, and we have a terrific social worker who's serving both campuses of Matthew Whaley and James River. And in all sincerity, I think we can continue to look at supporting those communities if we bring on an additional social worker. And then those 7 bus drivers we are suggesting add back into the budget. We had cut out a number last year. We find ourselves in a position of being able to continue to hire folks. and we believe we should continue to add them back in. That's great. I hope that there was also potentially a requisite drop at some point in the contracted services for transportation, to be determined, because we're not even halfway through the school year, but that would be a goal for us. And then let me talk a little bit about the central support staff positions. I'll start with the last one listed and work my way back. If you'll recall the transition plan and a number of the different specific items in our transition plan related to career and technical education, related to graduate action plans, related to trying to ensure that every one of our students has a particular pathway post high school graduation. We have a need to continue to add towards our student support and counseling realm, so we're recommending bringing that position into the operating budget. Our maintenance team, I believe, remains understaffed for the square footage that we're trying to maintain. So bringing in 2 maintenance assistants. Those are not necessarily tradespeople per se, but they're people that we would bring in and train up to become different members of those trades. Our finance team, relative to the amount of processing and internal work, as we demonstrated last year, is understaffed. So we would be recommending finance support in central office, and then an additional coordinator in human resources to help us maintain strong connectivity with the workforce in terms of who we've hired, and then also continuing to look at how do we continue to bring in and attract high quality staff. So this number, 21 FTEs, is a pared down version of last year, which is significantly pared down for what we were even talking about in the initial dialogue last year. Happy to answer questions about that if you have any.
Yes, Ms. Hunley?
I don't have any questions, but definitely, I know Ms. Chen and I serve on the external and internal for the gifted and talented, and after sitting in on just one meeting and seeing all their hopes and dreams for it, and knowing that we're understaffed, it is an equity issue. So that one definitely, and I'm really super excited about the 4 behavior support people, even though it's not 9, it is at least half, and that's hopeful to me. So those 2 things are the ones that really jump out at me first and foremost.
And to that point, Ms. Hunley, I believe that the total number will be 9. I believe that we have positions that we can reallocate for that purpose without adding additional FTEs. And I will say for the board and for anybody that is watching or going back and watching, we continue to have dialogue at the administrative level and at the building level around what positions do we need to reallocate or reconsider to be strong stewards of the public dollar, that we are not coming year over year asking for more and more staff when we understand that our enrollment is remaining flat or has decreased. We get it. I get it. The leadership team gets it. And so we are having really, in some cases, challenging conversations around how do we look at each of the different positions that are available to us and consider, is it necessary? Is it adding value to the students or staff on a daily basis? And if it's not, is there a way for us to reconfigure that? And so that's part of how, Ms. Hunley, we're getting to the number 9. And we will need to continue to do that. And it's a multi-part conversation, and it's very difficult in an organization of our size, because as you're doing that, in some cases you are talking about positions, but people interpret it as you're talking about people. And you're not intending to talk about Daniel Keever and the position that he's in. You're intending to talk about the work that Daniel Keever is doing, or could it be better or more effectively positioned? So it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Mr. Riffle?
Can we explain just a bit more about the school security officer? We have, clearly the 2 elementary schools right now that have security officers in their FTEs. Is just maybe more like a security standpoint, like why we're trying to bring them in now instead of wait an additional year, right? I know we talked about onboarding them earlier, the better we have the bucket to fill, but.
Right. I think part of it is where an occupied construction is not an easy scenario. And when I say that, I mean that that the work that's being done at CBB and the work that's being done at Norge to build the North Campus and South Campus is such that an additional person in both of those buildings on the security front would be helpful to both of those facilities. At the same time, if we brought one of them into the operating budget and assigned them to one of our high schools, for instance, if we assigned them to Lafayette, where we are also maintaining the reset program, where there's not assigned security, that might be a helpful component as well, because right now that building, though connected to Lafayette, sits apart, and so it's continuing to refine the utilization of the resources and then not coming back in next year's budget cycle and saying we need X number of positions for Bright Beginnings, but being proactive and thinking that through.
Sure. Thank you.
And as in another example, there's a social worker on the list for Bright Beginnings in fiscal 28. There's a potential, if we're able to bring it in this year, we may be able to reallocate and not have to bring that forward next year.
Thank you for the explanation.
Yes, Dr.
Dr.
Galapagos.
Keever, would the division find it beneficial to have a grant writer?
Yeah, maybe. And I'd hate to take a nuanced approach to that. It's potential that we've talked about that some. We've talked about, is there a way for us to start a process, maybe not with a full-time FTE, but with somebody that we bring on in a temporary employment agreement to help us pursue grants and write grants and potentially have that person's role written into a grant so that it can be funded that way. I'm not sure if we're in a position of specifically for fiscal 27 adding an FTE for a grant writer, but looking for a way to pursue additional grants.
So maybe you put a 0.5.
Potentially, or maybe we look at year-end funds that are available, or we look at some sort of temporary scenario that could start the process and it could be sustaining over.
I think the question is, are we leaving money on the table by not having a grant writer? Maybe.
Sometimes, but in a lot of the grant scenarios, you are also required to match. So while you may find additional, and I use the school security officer example, that
Right.
we believe we needed to add school security officers at all elementary schools. That's terrific. We wanted to do that. We applied for the grant. There is a recurring match that goes with that is based on our local composite index. So our match was higher than other school divisions' matches based on our LCI. So once you get to that point and some of the requirements in terms of paperwork, you get to the scenario where it's great that we have those folks, but would it be better to just bring them into the operating budget and not necessarily continue to utilize that grant? It's definitely something we're exploring. And I heard it loud and clear from Board of Supervisors, and I think that the city is also interested in looking at, grant support as well.
Okay. Looks like no other questions on this one.
How do we feel about the compensation components related to the 2% and adding with the compensation study for on the instructional side, and then the 3% for unified? Is that something that we should continue to pursue and be ready to share with you summary amounts of what an operating budget may look like in our next meeting? Or do you wish for us to look at some other alternatives there?
I've seen 4 head nods, yes. This is Jen.
I just wanted to say, I do think that it makes sense when I look at like slide 7. I know last week I'd asked a question about the 2%, but when I see it with at the different levels on slide 7, it's a range of at least 2% up to 6.73%. I'd be interested to maybe see a little bit more, but I think that's probably coming. I'd want to ensure, just as a broad sort of year-over-year goal, that, let's say, for example, I'm a teacher with a bachelor's with fewer years of experience, and I do fall into that 2.04% range, that I'm not, continuing in our division, and yet with the increased costs of healthcare that we know is inevitable, inflation, things like that, I'm not experiencing a decrease in my, even though my years of experience may go up, but my take home pay may not, so I guess maybe I'm giving an extreme example, and I don't want to say that I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just, I want to make sure that doesn't happen for an employee or for a teacher. And then I'll also add that something else that I saw with I do like the idea of the 3%. That makes sense for unified. I think that anything less than that wouldn't make sense. It would be great if we could do more, but the 3% on that front makes sense to me as well. In addition to the adjustments for equity and sort of implementing the comp study. So those part of the presentations, made sense to me. And just that one thing I wanted to make sure, if you're on that lower range, that we kind of pay attention to that.
Yes, ma'am. And I think that maybe we can look at some of the numbers related to, in aggregate, people's placement in years of service on scale, potentially to give you a sense of what that is. What I can't tell you is what somebody may choose relative to their health care and what their scenario is, right? And so that's where it gets a little bit harder to be able to say, and I don't want people to lose money either, but it's harder for us to then be able to project that out. We will, to that end around healthcare, spend some time on the 20th hearing from our consultant around general trends in healthcare and what we potentially need to anticipate. And we remain hopeful that there will be some level of healthcare reserve that we could tap into a bit of, but that's still to be determined.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other comments on this topic? Yes, Mr. Riffle.
This is not, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at this wrong. This last slide is not an addition of like the slides we saw before, or is this is just FTEs on this slide?
That's a dollar amount associated for those FTEs.
So there's a separate slide that would, or maybe presentation that would add the thoughts about the compensation together so we can kind of see like the magnitude of what we're asking for.
If you were to ask me the dollar amount for everything that we've talked about tonight, is that basically what you're asking me?
That's what I'm asking for, yeah.
Just under $9 million.
Okay. For compensation alone.
For compensation, contract changes, and FTEs.
Okay. Thank you.
And to that point, and as we think about positioning ourselves for a budget presentation on February 3rd, we do intend to give you some totals next week and summaries and say, here are the things that we've talked about, and here is our best thinking around what healthcare may be, and here is our best thinking around some of these other pieces. Are you ready for us to continue to move forward so that we can present that budget on February 3rd? And not that has to be, you're not approving the budget, but you're kind of giving us the continued, let's continue to move forward as we're talking.
You're talking about the 2x1s.
I'm talking about our presentation next Tuesday. We've got a budget work session next Tuesday.
Right.
And we're going to give you some summary totals, or we're going to try to give you some summary totals next Tuesday for all of these things that we've talked about. And then potentially in 2x1 conversations, are we headed where we need to head, which sets us up for the conversation on February 3rd.
Other questions? Yes, Mr. Hodges.
Less a question and more of a comment, just looking at the Masters regional ranking and I think this slide, which is slide 6, I think this one really kind of underscores how important implementing this compensation study is with the 2%. Just looking at these projections, I mean, some of the jumps are pretty impressive. Steps 10 to 11 going from 5th all the way up to 1st with this implemented, and you see as you're going through the steps, first, second, 3rd, like that's a pretty tremendous jump up for us, and I think that is the direction that we need to be heading for sure.
Ditto.
Other comments?
I'll
Yes,
also
Ms.
just
Jen.
reiterate that was part of our, when we were discussing our strategic plan. I will say that was something that was something that we did discuss being first, and I, seeing from where we came from when I was first started on the board 2 years ago, I'll say that when we were presented with where we were at, and we had to think about the strategic plan that summer, the first budgeting cycle I went through, we were 5th, 6th, pretty much dead last. So when it came time to do the strategic plan, I did raise some questions about that. So I will reiterate the dittos and the point made that it is quite encouraging to see that 2 years later this is possible, and that we are coming much closer to hitting that goal that we set in the strategic plan.
Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Mr. Riffle?
I agree with my colleagues. This is an important presentation. I know it's tough to look at the kind of the larger price point of it, but for us to slow down on the compensation now would be kind of a deterrent to our previous work to an extent. I think Mr. Hodges was right in his initial saying of like the jump in steps. It does cover, I think you said 2/3 of our employees are with advanced degrees, right?
That's right. Yeah. And on the instructional side, about 2/3 are masters and beyond, and a third are in the bachelor's category.
Right, that's a pretty big achievement for, I think, a division to take on is, when you can say that type of statistic, right? And then that only increases as we move into the next year of the compensation study, right? This is just kind of doing the work as you build the pyramid. So thank you.
Yes, Ms. Hunley?
No, I'm sorry. I have to remember to look this way to do this. National Board Certification, where does that fall in as far as how we compensate those teachers, and where does that money come from? I know we have to match it. I mean, how does that fall in our budget? I've never quite understood that. Sorry.
Phoning a friend to my right. Not Cara, evidently, because she pointed to her nose. Nose. So Renee and Tim, it is above and beyond. So national board stipends are above and beyond, and there is a mixture in the funding model. Right, Renee?
Right, so those individuals get payments from the state, which we pass on to the employees, and then we also budget for a supplement for those individuals.
Are you looking for the dollar amount as well?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I just want to make sure they're taken care of, and being one.
Sure.
And knowing how, you work hard for that.
Rigorous
and your
process,
money
absolutely.
So just wanted to make sure that was still secure, that's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? Yes. Other questions?
On the 20th, we will spend some time on healthcare. And we're going to bring in our consultant from USI to talk a little bit about what the trends are and what we need to be thinking about. That's a difficult conversation as well, because some of the pieces of concern around prescription drugs and drug case uses and those kinds of things would they're tough conversations, but there are potential opportunities for savings within that we need to likely consider as an organization. We gave you a placeholder number on a potential rate renewal increase. I believe in one of our previous work sessions, we haven't backed off of that yet, and we're still in a position of looking for what might be a payout that we owe to the local choice as we continue to cycle off that plan. The last thing I'll mention is that we are 4 months into our new plan year with Anthem. So some of those components are still, we are in a challenging spot just in terms of determining what the likely increase might be. And I say likely increase because I think you can anticipate that there will be a renewal rate increase. And if I'm wrong, I would be more than happy to be wrong. But I do think that there's going to be some level of increase. 100%. So at the back end of the presentation on the 20th, we'll spend some time with some summary dollar amounts to kind of let that sit with you and reflect on as we gear up for February 3rd. That's it from administration, Madam Chair.
All right. Well, with that, thank you for that very thorough presentation. Thank you, board members, for your inquisitive questions. And I call this meeting of the Williamsburg James City County School Board adjourned at 6:50 p.m.